Let's go to Mr. Land, the land of magic. Come on and see it. Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 33, Mr. Nonsense.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Nonsense had no sense at all. Not a scrap. I mean, he lived in a tree. A tree! Can you imagine? Why do you live in a tree? Mr. Happy asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried living on the ground, but that was too high up, so I moved to a tree to be nearer the ground. What nonsense, retorted Mr. Happy. Thank you, replied Mr. Nonsense. And do you know what Mr. Nonsense liked to eat? Porridge. Nothing wrong with that, you might say. But porridge on toast? Really? Why do you like porridge on toast? Mr. Nosy asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried porridge sandwiches and I didn't like them. And do you know where Mr. Nonsense sleeps every night? In a rowing boat, in his bedroom, in his house, up a tree. Why do you sleep in a rowing boat? Mr. Strong asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried sleeping in a motor boat, but it was somewhat uncomfortable. Mr. Nonsense lives, as you might very well expect, in a country called Nonsense Land. Now, I know somebody else who lives in Nonsense Land. Do you? That's right, Mr. Silly. Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense were close friends and saw a lot of each other. Mr. Nonsense was often round at Mr. Silly's house playing jigsaw puzzles. They used to throw the pieces at each other. How silly! And Mr. Silly was often round at Mr. Nonsense's house playing cards. They used to tear them up to see who could get the most pieces out of one card. What nonsense! However, the story is about the time it snowed in Nonsense Land. It didn't very often snow, but one winter it did. Now, tell me, what colour is snow? No, in Nonsense Land when it snows, it doesn't snow white snow, it snows yellow snow. Don't ask me why, but it does. Yellow snow. And when Mr. Silly woke up one morning, the whole of Nonsense Land was covered. I say, he said when he looked out of his bedroom window, snow! And he was so excited, he rushed round to Mr. Nonsense's house. Mr. Nonsense was asleep in his boat. Wake up! Cried Mr. Silly. Wake up and come and look out of the window. Whatever on earth is it? Grumbled Mr. Nonsense, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes as he got up and went across to his bedroom window. I say, he said, looking out. Custard! It isn't custard, you silly banana, cried Mr. Silly. That's snow. He rushed downstairs. Come on, he called, and that day Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense had one of the very best days of their lives. They had a snowball fight. Mr. Silly's snowballs were round. Mr. Nonsense made snowballs that, somehow or other, came out sort of square. They built a snowman, a very silly, nonsensical sort of a snowman. Come on, said Mr. Nonsense that afternoon. Let's go tobogganing. But we don't have a toboggan, said Mr. Silly. Oh no, we don't, agreed Mr. Nonsense. Mr. Silly thought. Oh, yes, we do, he cried. And Mr. Silly ran back to Mr. Nonsense's house and came back with his bed. Whee! They shouted together as they slid faster and faster down the hill in their rowing boat toboggan. It was a wonderful day, and that evening, after having supper together, porridge pie, Mr. Nonsense suggested that they played a game. What shall we play? Asked Mr. Silly. Draughts, suggested Mr. Nonsense. I've forgotten how to play draughts, said Mr. Silly. Oh, it's easy, replied Mr. Nonsense, and went round and opened all the doors and windows. There we are, he said. Druts! What nonsense.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 34, Mr. Wrong.
It really is a pantomime.
Whatever Mr. Wrong did was absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. However hard he tried, he just couldn't do anything right. Just look at his house! One fine morning, Mr. Wrong woke up. He hadn't slept very well because of the way he made his bed the day before. He jumped out of bed, fell over twice, put on his shoes on the wrong feet, went to the bathroom, tripping over the bath mat, squeezed out some toothpaste onto the wrong side of his toothbrush, cleaned his teeth, ouch, and went downstairs. Bump, 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 bump. Not a very good start to the day. In fact, his usual wrong start to the day. In his kitchen, Mr. Wrong poured some milk onto his cornflakes and missed. As he sat in his kitchen that fine morning, eating his dried cornflakes, he sighed. Oh dear, he thought. I do so wish that everything I do wasn't quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. So, after breakfast, he went for a walk in order to think how he could solve his problem. It took him 10 minutes to get out of the house because he kept trying to open his front door outwards instead of inwards. As he walked along, he passed a worm. Good morning, dog, he said. The worm grinned. He was used to Mr. Wrong. He met a postman. Good morning, Mr. Wrong, called the postman cheerfully. Good morning, doctor, replied Mr. Wrong. Oh, dear. He met old Mrs. Twinkle, who lived down the lane. Good morning, Mr. Wrong, she smiled. Good morning, Mr. Twinkle, replied Mr. Wrong. Oh, dear. And then he met somebody he'd never met before. Somebody who sort of looked like him, but didn't. Good morning, sir, said that somebody. Good morning, madam, replied Mr. Wrong. I'm Mr. Wrong. I guessed that, replied the person. Well, I'm Mr. Right. Now, tell me, he went on, why are you walking along looking so miserable? Because, replied Mr. Wrong, I can't do anything right. In which case, said Mr. Right, we'd better do something about it. Follow me. And off he set. And off set Mr. Wrong, in the opposite direction. Mr. Right hurried back and turned him round. This way, he said, and they walked together to where Mr. Right lived. It was a house which somehow looked something like Mr. Wrong's house, but different. Mr. Right took Mr. Wrong into his living room. I think, he said, that the only way you're ever going to change is for you to come and live with me for a while. And you may end up being not quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong about everything. Sit down, he said, and we'll talk about it. Mr. Wrong sat down and missed. Mr. Wrong stayed with Mr. Right for a month, and during that time, he changed. After 1 week, he was slightly less wrong than he had been before. After 2 weeks, he was even more slightly less wrong than he had been before. And after a whole 4 weeks, he was a changed Mr. Man. You could hardly tell the difference between him and Mr. Right. Don't you agree? Mr. Right was delighted. Told you, he cried. Told you that everything about you might end up being not quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. In fact, he continued, you've really turned out all right. Mr. Wrong blushed. It was quite the nicest thing anyone had ever said to him in the whole of his life. And he went home and lived happily and right ever after. Now, you probably think that's the end of the story, don't you? Well, it isn't. And the reason it isn't is because of what happened to Mr. Right. The trouble was, you see, that the longer Mr. Wrong had stayed with Mr. Right, and the more right Mr. Wrong became, the more wrong Mr. Right had become. Isn't that extraordinary? "Oh dear," Mr. Right sighed. "My plan didn't quite work out the way I planned it after all." And he went to bed. In the bath.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 35. Mr. Skinny.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Skinny was extraordinarily thin, painfully thin. If he turned sideways, you could hardly see him at all. And what made it even worse was that he lived in a place called Fatland. Yes, Fatland. As you can very well imagine, everything and everybody in Fatland was as fat as could be. Not stout, fat. Fatland dogs were extremely fat. Fatland worms were extraordinarily fat. Fatland birds were exceedingly fat. And you should see a Fatland elephant. Whew! And there, in the middle of all this fatness, lived Mr. Skinny, in the thinnest house you've ever seen. Poor Mr. Skinny. He didn't like being so different from everything and everybody. But there wasn't very much he could do about it. You see, he had hardly any appetite at all. And Mr. Skinny meal was a very meagre affair. Do you know what he had for breakfast? 1 cornflake. And for lunch, 1 baked bean. And for tea, nothing. And for supper, the world's smallest sausage. And after that, he felt so full, he went straight to bed. In his long, thin bed, in his long, thin bedroom, in his long, thin house in Fatland. Oh, I do so wish I could do something about my appetite, he sighed to himself just before he went to sleep. I think, he thought, that I'd better go and see the doctor about it. And he went to sleep. The following morning was lovely. A large fat sun shone down on the fat green trees and the fat yellow flowers, and through them walked Mr. Skinny on his way to see the doctor. Dr. Plump. "Come in! Come in!" he wheezed as Mr. Skinny knocked at his door. "Sit down! Sit down!" he wheezed as Mr. Skinny entered. "And what," he wheezed, putting his plump fingers together, "seems to be the trouble?" "It's my appetite," explained Mr. Skinny. "I like to be able to eat more so I could put on a little weight." "Yes, you rather are, how shall I put it, thin," wheezed the doctor, looking at him over his glasses. "I know," he continued. "Let's start the treatment right now." He licked his lips. "This very moment," he added, and he opened a drawer in his desk and took out an enormous cream cake. He put it on the desk in front of him, and opened another drawer and took out 6 doughnuts, and put them on the desk in front of him, and opened another drawer and took out 12 currant buns, and put them on the desk in front of him. 11 C's, he explained. "But it's only 10 o'clock, said Mr. Skinny. "Who's counting?" wheezed Dr. Plump, and without further ado, he and Mr. Skinny ate the lot. Mr. Skinny ate a dab of cream, a donut crumb, and 1 currant. Mr. Plump ate the rest. Wheezed Dr. Plump, popping the last currant bun into his mouth and looking at Mr. Skinny. "I see," he said. "What you mean about your appetite?" He thought for a moment. "Only one thing for it," he wheezed. "This calls for drastic measures." And he picked up his telephone in his podgy fingers and dialed a number. 100 miles away, the telephone rang. "Brr, brr, brr, brr." "Hello," said a voice. "Do you know whose voice it was?" "Mr. Greedy speaking," said the voice. Mr. Greedy listened to what Dr. Plump had to say. "You'd like a Mr. Skinny to come to stay," he said. "To build up his appetite," he added. "Delighted," he agreed. And so Mr. Skinny went to stay with Mr. Greedy. He stayed for a month, and during that time, Mr. Greedy did manage to increase Mr. Skinny's appetite. And so, at the end of the month, Mr. Skinny returned home, happy, with a tummy. A tummy was something Mr. Skinny had always wanted. I never knew I had it in me, he chuckled to himself. He was feeling so proud of his tummy, he decided to call in and see Dr. Plump on his way home.
I say,
wheezed Dr. Plump, looking him up and down.
Congratulations! Tell you what,
he went on,
this calls for celebration.
And he opened his desk drawer.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. C, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 36, Mr. Mischief.
It really is a pantomime.
Poor Mr. Happy had had a tiring day. Rushing here and there and back again, cheering people up was hard work. Phew, he sighed as he went into his house and sat down for a well-earned rest on a kitchen chair. But then, do you know what happened? It fell to bits. Bump went poor Mr. Happy. That's all I need, he said. I rather think that I have had a visit from Mr. Mischief. He was right. Outside Mr. Happy's house, and running away as fast as his little legs would carry him, was a small, mischievous figure, Mr. Mischief. "Oh, Mischief, glorious Mischief," he cried. "I do so love it." And he ran giggling into the night. The next morning, there was a knock at Mr. Greedy's front door. But when he went to answer it, there was nobody there. But what was there was a box, and inside the box was a large chocolate cake filled with cream and with the most delicious-looking pink icing. Mr. Greedy's eyes gleamed. He licked his lips and shut his eyes and opened his mouth and took a large bite. Ugh! The chocolate wasn't chocolate, it was mud. The cream inside wasn't cream, it was cotton wool. And that delicious-looking pink icing wasn't icing at all. It was toothpaste! And outside Mr. Greedy's house, and running away as fast as his little legs would carry him, was a small, mischievous figure, giggling as he ran. That's not all. That very same morning, Mr. Funny discovered that somebody had filled his hat with treacle. Very sticky treacle. Can you guess who that somebody might have been? However, that very same afternoon, Mr. Mischief did something that he was to regret. He was walking along through the woods, looking for mischief, when he came across a wizard. A fast-asleep wizard. "I know," giggled Mr. Mischief. "I'll change the wizard's wand for an ordinary piece of wood, and then he can't do any magic." He grinned a mischievous grin and crept quietly towards the slumbering wizard. Mr. Mischief reached carefully out and seized the wizard's magic wand. But what he didn't know was that wizards' wands don't like to be seized. "Help!" shrieked the wand in a high, shrill voice, and awakened the wizard, who in turn seized Mr. Mischief by his nose, which was extremely painful. "Let go of my nose!" cried Mr. Mischief. "I know who you are," said the wizard. "You're that Mr. Mischief that sawed through poor Mr. Happy's chair legs. And," he continued, "baked a rather unusual cake for poor Mr. Greedy. And," he went on, "put treacle in poor Mr. Funny's hat. I've been hearing all about you," he added. "Let go of my nose!" cried Mr. Mischief again. "Very well," said the wizard, "but don't believe that you can get away with being as mischievous as that." And, as he let go of Mr. Mischief's nose, he got hold of his magic wand and waved it. "Beware," he said, and went off. "Silly wizard," muttered Mr. Mischief. "Can't you take a joke?" And he went home. "Silly wizard," he said again, as he sat down in his kitchen. Bump! "Silly, silly, silly wizard," groaned Mr. Mischief, picking himself up. "Him and his silly magic." and he made himself some porridge for tea. Smiled Mr. Mischief as he put a large spoonful of porridge into his mouth. Ah! Somehow, as if by magic, which of course it was, the porridge had turned into sawdust! Oh dear, spluttered Mr. Mischief. Perhaps I had better not get up to quite so much mischief in future after all. And he went upstairs. He jumped into bed. The bed was full of raspberry jam. Oh dear, sighed Mr. Mischief. I think I definitely must not get up to quite so much mischief in future. And do you know something? The day after, he was as good as gold. And the next day, and the day after that, it lasted a week. And then that old mischievous urge got the better of him. He just couldn't help himself. It was a Saturday night. He crept into Mr. Fussy's house when he was fast asleep. And can you guess what he did? Oh, what a beautiful piece of perfect mischief, he cried as he ran giggling home. He'd cut off half of Mr. Fussy's mustache. Isn't that terrible? Poor Mr. Fussy. He was absolutely horrified when he awoke and found out. But even that terrible piece of mischief is not the end of Mr. Mischief's story. So, before you read this last page, just take a look out of the window. Go on. You can't see a small, mischievous figure anywhere about. Can you? Are you sure?
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 37, Mr. Clever.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Clever was quite the cleverest person ever. The cleverest person in the world. And he knew it. Oh, I am so very, very clever, he used to say, to himself more often than not. He lived in Cleverland, where, as you may know, everybody and everything is as clever as can be. In Cleverland, clever trees manage to grow apples and oranges at the same time. In Cleverland, clever flowers get up and go for a walk. Clever worms drive around in cars all day. And clever elephants play tennis. Oh yes, Cleverland is quite the most clever place. Would you like to live there? Mr. Clever does. Oh, I am so very, very clever to build such a clever house, he used to go around telling everybody. One morning, Mr. Clever was awakened by his special Mr. Clever alarm clock. Not only did it wake you up by ringing a bell, it also switched on a light and said, "Good morning," and made a cup of tea, and showed what the weather was going to be, and told you the time, and showed you the date. It also whistled cheerfully while it was doing all that. Mr. Clever yawned, got up, washed, cleaned his teeth with his special Mr. Clever toothbrush, which squeezed toothpaste onto the brush out of the handle, and went downstairs for breakfast. He popped a slice of bread into his special Mr. Clever electric toaster, which not only toasted the bread, but also spread it with butter and marmalade, and cut off the crusts. After breakfast, he went for a long walk, an extremely long walk. In fact, such a long walk that he walked all the way out of Cleverland, although he didn't know it. He met somebody who was also out for a walk. Do you know who it was? That's right, Mr. Happy. "Hello," cried Mr. Clever. "I'm the cleverest person in the world." "Oh, good," said Mr. Happy. "Then you must be clever enough to make up a really good joke to tell me." He laughed. "Jokes make me happy," he explained. Mr. Clever's face fell. "I don't know any jokes," he admitted. Well, that's not very clever of you, is it?" said Mr. Happy, and went off. Mr. Clever went on. And do you know who he met next? That's right, Mr. Greedy. "Hello," said Mr. Clever. "I'm the cleverest person in the world."
"Oh, good," said Mr. Greedy. "Then you can tell me the recipe of the world's most delicious dish."
He licked his lips.
I like food, he explained.
Mr. Clever's face fell.
I can't cook, he admitted, and I don't know any recipes. Well, that's not very clever of you, is it?
Said Mr. Greedy, and went off in search of food. Mr. Clever went on. And who do you think he met next? Yes, Mr. Forgetful.
Hello, cried Mr. Clever. I'm the cleverest person in the world.
Oh, good, said Mr. Forgetful. Then you can tell me what my name is. He smiled apologetically. I've forgotten, he explained. Mr. Clever's face fell for the third time that morning.
But I don't know your name, he admitted. We've only just met.
Well, that's not very clever of you, is it? Said Mr. Forgetful, and he too went off, forgetting to say goodbye. And so it went on, all day. Mr. Clever couldn't tell Mr. Sneeze the cure for a cold, and he couldn't tell Mr. Small how he could grow bigger, and he couldn't tell Mr. Jelly what the secret of being brave was, and he couldn't tell Mr. Topsy-Turvy how to talk the round way right. I mean the right way round. A not very clever day. Not at all. Not a bit. As by now he wasn't feeling like the cleverest person in the world, Mr. Clever decided he'd better go home. He passed a pair of worms who were having a chat.
Who's that? Asked one worm.
That, replied the other worm, is Mr. Clever, the cleverest person in the world, on his way home to Cleverland. The first worm thought.
That can't be clever, he replied. He's going the wrong way.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. See all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 38, Mr. Busy.
It really is a pantomime.
There's never been anybody quite like Mr. Busy. He could do things 10 times as fast as ever you and I could. For instance, if he was reading this book, he'd have finished it by now. He lived in a very busy-looking house, which he built himself, as you can see. He had lots of doors and windows, and do you know what it was called? Weekend Cottage. Do you know why? Because that's how long it took him to build it. One fine summer morning, Mr. Busy was up and about bright and early at 6 o'clock. He jumped out of bed and had a bath, and cleaned his teeth, and cooked his breakfast, and ate his breakfast, and read the paper, and washed up, and made his bed, and cleaned the house from top to bottom, by which time it was 7 o'clock. Busy Mr. Busy! Now, next door to Mr. Busy lived somebody who wasn't quite such a busy person. In fact, he was a very unbusy person. Mr. Slow. If he was reading this book, he'd read it like this. He'd still be on the first page. And that same fine summer morning, at 7:05, when Mr. Busy knocked at his door, Mr. Slow was fast asleep in bed. He'd gone to bed for an afternoon nap the day before, and somehow hadn't woken up until he heard Mr. Busy knocking at his door.
Who's that knocking at my door?
He called downstairs. Good morning, cried Mr. Busy. Can I come in? And without waiting for an answer, he went inside. Where are you? He called.
Upstairs,
came the slow reply. So Mr. Busy went upstairs, 2 at a time. Good heavens, he said. You're still in bed. And he made Mr. Slow get up. And he made his bed for him, and cooked his breakfast for him, and cleaned his house for him. Poor Mr. Slow. He hated to be rushed and fussed. Right, said Mr. Busy briskly. It's fine, dear. Let's go for a picnic. Mr. Slow pulled a face.
I don't like picnics,
he complained. Nonsense, replied Mr. Busy, and busied himself around Mr. Slow's kitchen, making up a picnic for the two of them. It took him a minute and a half. Right, he cried when he finished. Off we go! And he bustled Mr. Slow out of his front door, and off they set. As you can imagine, Mr. Busy walks extremely quickly, and, as you can imagine, Mr. Slow doesn't. So by the time Mr. Busy had walked a mile, do you know how far Mr. Slow had walked? To his own garden gate. Mr. Busy hurried back. "Come on," he cried impatiently. "Hurry up!"
"Hurry up," replied Mr. Slow. "Impossible."
"All right," said Mr. Busy. "We'll have a picnic in your garden. Wait a minute, though," he added. "The grass needs cutting." And he rushed back to Weekend Cottage, and rushed back again with his lawn-mower, and rushed up and down cutting Mr. Slow's lawn. It took him 2.5 minutes. It would have taken him 2 minutes, but he had to mow around Mr. Slow, who couldn't get out of the way in time. "Right," said Mr. Busy. "Picnic time!" And together, on that fine summer day, they had a fine picnic. Well, actually, Mr. Busy had a finer picnic than Mr. Slow, because he ate more quickly and had most of the food. Mr. Busy stretched out on the grass. "That was fun," he said. "I like picnics."
"You do. I don't,"
said Mr. Slow. "Tell you what," went on Mr. Busy, ignoring him. "Tomorrow we'll go on a proper picnic out in the country." Mr. Slow pulled a face. "And," went on Mr. Busy, "in order to do that and get you out into the country, I'll have to call for you earlier than I did this morning." Mr. Slow pulled another face. "See you tomorrow, then," said Mr. Busy, and went home and cleaned his house from bottom to top. The following morning, Mr. Busy jumped out of bed at 5 o'clock, and had a bath, and cleaned his teeth, and cooked his breakfast, and ate his breakfast, and read the paper, and washed up, and made his bed, and cleaned the house from top to bottom, by which time it was 6 o'clock. He went and knocked on Mr. Slow's front door. Come on, he cried. "Time to be up and about! Picnic day!" No reply. "Come on!" cried Mr. Busy again. No reply. Mr. Busy went inside, and went upstairs, 3 at a time, and into Mr. Slow's bedroom, expecting to find him in bed. But he wasn't. And he wasn't anywhere upstairs. And he wasn't anywhere downstairs. "Bother!" said Mr. Busy. "I wonder where he's got to." Where Mr. Slow had got to was under his bed. Hiding. He didn't want to go on any picnic. Not he. "Bother!" said Mr. Busy again. "That means I'll have to go on a picnic on my own." Under his bed, Mr. Slow smiled a slow smile.
"What a good idea,"
he said, and went to sleep, snoring very slowly.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. See all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 39, Mr. Slow.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Slow, as you might well know, or maybe you don't, lived next door to Mr. Busy. He built his house himself. Slowly. It had taken him 10 years. And, as you may well know, or maybe you don't, Mr. Slow talked in an extraordinarily slow way. He talked like this. And every single thing he did was as slow as the way he talked. For instance, if Mr. Slow was writing this book about himself, you wouldn't be able to read it yet. He wouldn't even have got as far as this page. For instance, if Mr. Slow was eating a currant cake for tea, it took him until bedtime. He'd eat it crumb by crumb, currant by currant, chewing each crumb and each currant 100 times. For instance, last Christmas, it took Mr. Slow until New Year's Eve to open his Christmas presents. And then it took him until Easter to write his thank you letters. Oh, he was a slow man. Now, this story isn't about the time Mr. Slow went on a picnic with Mr. Busy. That's another story. No, this story is about the time Mr. Slow decided to get a job. He read all the job advertisements in the Sunday paper, which took him until Wednesday. And then he went and got himself a job reading the news on television. Can you imagine? It was very embarrassing.
"Good evening, said Mr. Slow. Here is the 9 o'clock news.
It took him until midnight to read it, and everybody who was watching went to sleep. So, that job wasn't very good, was it? Then, Mr. Slow got himself a job as a taxi driver.
Take me to the railway station, cried Mr. Uppity as he leapt into his taxi. I have a train to catch at 3 o'clock. Right. Ho,
said Mr. Slow, and set off at 1 mile an hour, and arrived at the station at 4 o'clock. So that job wasn't very good, was it? And that summer, Mr. Slow got a job making ice cream. But by the time he'd made the ice cream, it wasn't exactly the right sort of weather to be selling ice cream. So, Mr. Slow got himself a job making woolly scarves. But by the time he'd finished making the scarves, it wasn't exactly the right sort of weather to be selling scarves. Phew! Poor Mr. Slow. He went around to ask the other Mr. Men what he should do.
Be a racing driver,
suggested Mr. Silly. Can you imagine? No. Be an engine driver, suggested Mr. Funny. Can you imagine? No, no. Be a speedboat driver, suggested Mr. Tickle. Can you imagine? No, no, no. But then Mr. Happy had an extremely good idea. Most sensible. Be a steamroller driver, he suggested. And today that is exactly what Mr. Slow does. Slowly backwards and slowly forwards he drives. Up and down and up, ever so slowly. The next time you see a steamroller doing that, look and see if Mr. Slow's driving it. If he is, you shout to him, "Hello, Mr. Slow, are you having a nice time?" And he'd wave and shout back to you,
"Yes, thank you. Good bye."